The ash on Meridian did not behave like ash. It did not drift or settle or gray the way fire's leavings did on 100 honest worlds. It hung. It held its shape in the still air above the ruined quadrangles of the conquered Lyceum, suspended in soft columns where the buildings had stood, as if the world itself could not decide whether the school had been burned or simply unremembered. When the wind came in off the northern sea, it did not scatter these columns. It passed through them, and they trembled, and they did not fall. Wren Halloran stood at the edge of what had been the youngest cohort's garden, and understood, in a slow and terrible way, that she was looking at the difference between destruction and subtraction. Destruction leaves a mark. Subtraction leaves a wound where the mark should be. She was 17 years old, and 11 days earlier she had been the second oldest human student at the Lyceum, a scholarship girl 3 years into a program most Earthborn never tested into, with ink on her fingers and a half-finished thesis on comparative Greek rights, saved to a slate that now felt like an obscene joke. 11 days earlier she had been on the transport home for the solstice recess, 4 light hours out, watching Meridian shrink to a blue coin in the aft window, and thinking about nothing more important than whether she had remembered to water the moss in the greenhouse. She had not thought to look back a second time. That was the thing she would carry. There had been a moment, a single unremarkable moment, when Meridian had still been whole behind her, and she had turned to her book instead of the window, and she would spend a long time learning to forgive herself for it. Because in that moment 5,731 children had still been alive, and she had been reading. By the time the transport docked, they were not. Not dead. That was the word the galaxy would not let anyone use, and the word Wren had already decided she would use for the rest of her life. Not casualties, not losses. The conquered had a word, and the word was clean, and the word was subtraction. And the word meant that according to the ledger of the even sum, the children of the youngest cohort had not been killed, because you cannot kill what has been removed from the sum of things that are. They had been struck from the record. The ledger did not say they had died. The ledger said they had never been. Wren had spent her first 3 days back on Meridian screaming at officials who blinked at her with the patient, unreadable calm of beings who did not understand the noise she was making, because in their grammar there was no one to grieve. You could not mourn a name that had been unwritten. You could not hold a funeral for an absence. The forms did not exist. The words did not exist. And when she had insisted, when she had stood in the Concord's processing hall and read aloud the names she remembered, 30 of them, 40, her voice cracking on each one, a gray-robed clerk of the ordinate had listened with something that might have been pity in another species and had said, gently, that she was describing a set with no members, and that continued recitation would be logged as a disturbance. That was when Wren had stopped screaming and started remembering on purpose. Because she had learned something in that hall, something the clerk had not meant to teach her. The ledger could unwrite a name. It could not reach into her skull and unwrite the child. She knelt now in the garden's ash, in the strange suspended gray, and she said the first name again, the way she had said it every morning for 11 days, quietly, to no official, to no form. Aya, she said. The columns of ash trembled and did not fall. Meridian had been a school world. That was the whole of it, the entire purpose of the place. And it was the thing that made what had happened there feel less like a crime, and more like a category error in the mind of the universe. There were fortress worlds and factory worlds and worlds that were nothing but oceans of computation humming under ice, and the galaxy had always understood in its long, cold way that such worlds were sometimes lost. But Meridian had been made for the young. The conquered Lyceum had gathered the children of 40 species onto one temperate blue globe, and taught them, together. In the oldest and most sentimental experiment, the galaxy still permitted itself. The belief that if the young of many peoples grew up in the same gardens, learned the same hard mathematics, skinned the same knees on the same low walls, then perhaps the galaxy that they inherited would be a little less willing to unmake itself. It had been a beautiful idea. Wren had believed in it. She had come 9,000 light years to believe in it, an ordinary girl from an ordinary rain-soaked city on Earth, tested and lucky and stubborn, and for 3 years the belief had been rewarded. She had learned 6 languages that used sound and 4 that did not. She had argued cosmology with a crustacean-descended boy who thought in prime numbers and homesickness with a veiled girl whose people did not have a word for home. She had been happy in the particular exhausted way of the young who are learning faster than they can hold. And she had looked after the little ones. Every older student did. It was built into the Lyceum's life, the old caring for the new, and Wren's charge had been the human cluster in the youngest cohort. The 6- and 7-year-olds, too small yet for the great halls, kept in the low buildings around the garden where the moss grew, and the walls were painted the color of a summer nobody on Meridian had ever actually seen. Aya had been the smallest of them. Aya had been 6 years old, from a resettlement world Wren had never visited, with a gap where her front teeth had been and a habit of asking questions in threes. Why does the moss grow only there and not there, and can I move it? Why do the stars look bigger here and closer, and can I have one? Why did you come so far, and were you scared, and will you stay? Aya had decided, on no evidence, that Wren was the wisest person on Meridian, and Wren, 17 and secretly terrified of nearly everything, had not corrected her, because it had felt good to be somebody's certainty. Aya had a word she liked. She had found it in the human primer, and it had delighted her because it did not exist in the conquered tongue, and she had gone around the garden using it on everything until the smaller children caught it too. The word was again, do it again, read it again, the stars again tomorrow. Aya had understood, in the way small children understand enormous things without knowing they have understood them, that again was a kind of promise, that a thing that had happened once could be asked to happen once more, that the world could be persuaded to repeat its kindnesses. Wren thought about that a great deal now, in the ash, about a 6-year-old who had loved a word that meant the world could be asked to give something back. The Concord's word could not be asked for anything. The Concord's word only took. They came for Wren on the 12th day, and she knew before they spoke that they were not the gray clerks of the ordinate, because these were tall, and they were silent, and they wore the deep unlit color of the even sum itself, not a color so much as an absence arranged in the shape of robes. There were 3 of them. They had crossed the dead garden without disturbing the ash, and they stood at a courteous distance while the tallest inclined its long head and spoke in a voice that had been trained on so many languages that it had lost the accent of all of them. "You are the witness," it said. Wren stood, her knees ached from the cold ground. "I'm a student," she said. "I was a student here." "You are the recorded witness," the tall one corrected, without unkindness. "You were absent from the world at the hour of the subtraction. You are the sole living being of the Lyceum's registered body who both knew the youngest cohort and was not within the accounting when it was closed. This makes you, under the Concord's oldest procedure, the witness. You are entitled to the word." Wren did not understand, and she said so. The tall one explained, and as it explained, Wren felt something cold begin in her chest and spread. There was to be a right. When the Concord subtracted a thing of significance, a city, a fleet, a world, the even sum required that the removal be balanced not only in the ledger but in the presence of the assembly, the gathering of the galaxy's peoples, so that the sum of what was witnessed and the sum of what was recorded would agree. It was, the tall one said, a matter of hygiene. An unwitnessed subtraction left a residue, a discrepancy. And so before the record of Meridian could be sealed forever, before the world and the school and the 5,731 could be made, formally and finally, to have never been, the assembly would convene, and the subtraction would be pronounced, and there was, in the oldest form of the procedure, a provision. The witness could speak. For how long? Wren asked. Her voice did not sound like her own. One utterance, the tall one said. The form permits the witness a single word. It is a courtesy. It is very old. It predates the ledger's perfection from a time when the Concord's balancing was cruder and the assembly less certain, and it survives, as old forms do, without function. The witness speaks one word and the assembly records that a witness spoke, and the residue is discharged and the seal is set. One word, Wren repeated. One word, the tall one agreed. It changes nothing. It has never changed anything. In 4,000 years, no word spoken by a witness has altered a single subtraction, because whatever is spoken is itself within the accounting, and the accounting is closed by the same hand that opens it. But the form must be observed. And so you are summoned. You will be brought before the assembly and before the throne, and you will be given the word and you will speak it, and meridian will be sealed. Wren looked past the three figures at the columns of ash that would not fall. Before the throne, she said slowly. He'll be there, the one who did this. For the first time the tall one hesitated, and when it answered, its trained and accentless voice had gone very slightly careful, the way a voice goes careful near an edge. The throne does not do, it said. That is the first thing you must learn before you stand in the assembly, human, or you will disgrace yourself and your dead a second time. The throne is not a being that acts. The throne is the point at which the even sum expresses what the even sum requires. A world was subtracted because the ledger showed that it must be. No one did this. It was balanced. If you go into the assembly believing that a person killed your children, you will speak your one word against a person, and there is no person there, and your word will fall into the accounting and be closed, and you will have wasted the only thing the dead have left. The cold in Wren's chest had reached her hands. And if I don't believe that, she said. If I know a person did it. The tall one regarded her for a long moment with eyes that did not blink. Then you will be the first witness in 4,000 years to walk into the assembly with a weapon, it said, and you will not know how to use it, and the throne will unmake you in the record before you have finished your breath. Do not mistake me. I am not warning you away. I am the even sum's servant, and I want the seal set clean, and I want no residue. But I have crossed a dead garden to fetch a child to speak one word at the being that emptied it, and I find that I have been in the Concord's service for 600 years, and I do not entirely wish you to fail. It said this without inflection, as though reporting a fact about the weather, and then it seemed faintly surprised at itself, and it straightened, and the moment passed. You will be given time to prepare your word, it said. Choose it with care. It is the last thing that will ever be said of Meridian before Meridian ceases to have been. They gave her a cell that was not a cell, a clean, warm room aboard a Concord vessel, with a window that showed the stars and a slate that would not connect to anything and food that arrived without anyone bringing it. They gave her 9 days, the length of the crossing to the seat of the assembly, to choose one word. Wren did not sleep much. She sat at the false window and she made lists, the way she had always made lists, because a list was a small fence you could put around a grief too large to hold all at once. She listed the words that meant what he was: murderer, butcher, coward. She tried each one in her mouth and each one fell out of it dead. She understood dimly what the tall servant had been telling her. Those were words aimed at a person, and the throne had spent 4,000 years making itself into something a person word could not touch. To call the throne a murderer was to call the ocean cruel. The word would slide off the surface of a thing that had arranged, with enormous patience, to have no surface. She listed the words that meant what she felt. Grief was one of them, and she sat with it a long while, because she had come to Meridian to study grief, to study the way the galaxy's 40 peoples carried their dead, and she had learned that most of them did not carry them at all. The veil released their dead into forgetting on purpose, as a mercy. The prime-thinking crustaceans folded their dead into a final sum and considered the matter closed. Only a handful of species did what humans did, which was to refuse, to keep the dead present in the mouth and the memory, to say the names, to insist that a person who had been was a person who still, in some stubborn and unaccountable way, is. She had thought before Meridian that this was a quaint thing about her species, a sentimentality, a failure to accept the arithmetic of the universe. Sitting at the false window 9 light days from the throne, she began to understand that it was a weapon, and that no one in the galaxy but humans had ever thought to sharpen it. Because the Conquered's power was not fire. The Conquered had fleets and subtractors and the terrible cold machinery of the even sum, but that was not what made the throne unbreakable. What made the throne unbreakable was that it could reach into the record of reality and unwrite a thing so completely that the galaxy would agree the thing had never been. It ruled by erasure. It ruled because its enemies did not merely die. They stopped having existed, and a cause with no history recruits no martyrs, and a war you can be made never to have fought is a war you cannot win. And the entire architecture of that power rested on one assumption so deep that the Conquered had forgotten it was an assumption at all. It rested on the assumption that the record was the only place a thing could be kept. Wren sat very still. She thought about the ledger, which could unwrite any name. She thought about a clerk in a processing hall telling her she was describing a set with no members. She thought about her own skull, which the ledger could not open, and the name that was written in it in a hand no Conquered edit could reach. She thought about a 6-year-old who had loved a word that meant a thing could be asked to happen again. And on the 4th night of the crossing, alone in a warm room that was not a cell, watching stars she was not sure the throne would permit to go on existing, Wren Halloran began, very quietly, to understand what her one word would be. She did not say it aloud. Not yet. She was not a fool. She did not know whether the warm room listened. But she held it behind her teeth, small and certain, and for the first time since the transport had pulled away from a world she had not looked back at, she was not only afraid. She was also, in a cold and rising and human way, ready. On the 5th day of the crossing, the human delegation came aboard. Wren had not known there was a human delegation. She had assumed, in the numb way she had assumed everything since Meridian, that she was alone in this. One girl, one word, one throne. And when the tall servant of the even sum came to tell her that her people had been permitted to send an escort, she had felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was clenched. There were 4 of them, and they were not soldiers, and they were not, in any way that mattered to the Conquered, powerful. Humanity was a young signatory to the assembly, a species barely 2 centuries into the wider galaxy, holding worlds that could be counted on 2 hands, permitted into the great forums out of a courtesy that everyone understood could be withdrawn. The Conquered did not fear humans. The Conquered did not fear anyone, but it feared humans less than most, because humans had nothing the ledger wanted and nothing the subtractors needed, and no history long enough to complicate the sum. The one who led them was an old woman named Solemn, and she was the first human being over 40 that Wren had seen in 11 days, and the sight of her lined face nearly undid the careful thing Wren had built behind her teeth. Solemn was humanity's senior envoy to the assembly, which meant she had spent 30 years learning to survive in rooms designed to erase her, and it showed in her the way weather shows in stone. She was small and dry and unhurried. She looked at Wren for a long moment when they were finally alone in the warm room, and she did not offer comfort, which Wren was grateful for, because comfort would have been a lie and Wren had had enough lies to last her whole life. "They told me you were a child," Idris said. "You're not a child." "I'm 17. "That's what I said." Idris lowered herself into the room's single chair without asking. "You were a child 11 days ago. You're not one now. That's what they do, the ones like the throne. They make children into something else, and then they file the paperwork saying the children were never there." She studied Wren's face. "You know what you're walking into." They told me, one word, it changes nothing. That's the official position, yes. Idris folded her hands. Let me tell you the unofficial one, because you're going to hear a great deal of the official position in the days ahead, and it will all be true and all be useless. Do you know what the throne is, Wren Halloran? Not the doctrine, the thing. Wren said nothing. He was a person once, Idris said. That much even the conquered doesn't deny, though they've buried it under 4,000 years of theology. Their emperors are not born and they are not chosen. They are made. A candidate is taken young, very young, and given to the ledger, and over a lifetime the person is written out and the office is written in, until there is nothing left that can be called by a name. That's the whole trick of them, do you understand? The throne cannot be held guilty of anything because guilt requires a self, and their entire sacred art is the removal of the self. When the throne subtracts a world, no one has acted. There is no author. There is only the even sum expressing its necessity through an instrument that has been carefully hollowed out until it can hold no blame. That's obscene, Wren said quietly. It's efficient, Idris said. Obscene things usually are. But listen to me, because this is the part they won't tell you, and it's the only part that matters. She leaned forward. It's a doctrine. It is not a fact. He tells the galaxy he is not a person, and the galaxy agrees, and 4,000 years of agreement have made it very nearly true. But nearly true is not true. Somewhere under the office there is still the shape of the one who was hollowed out. I have stood in the assembly and watched him seal 100 subtractions, and once, girl, in 30 years, I saw the office flicker. A delegate from a world he was unmaking said something. I never learned what, in a tongue I didn't know, and for the length of a breath the throne stopped. Just stopped. And then the servants moved, and the delegate's world was sealed. And by the next session no one but me remembered that a delegate had ever spoken, because the delegate had been on the world and the world was gone, and so the speaking had never happened. The warm room was very quiet. You're telling me it can be done, Wren said. I'm telling you it happened once, and it was undone within the hour, because the only being who ever reached him was inside the very subtraction he was sealing, and the sealing swallowed the reaching. Idris's dry voice did not change, but something behind it did. That's why you matter. Do you understand now why they call you the witness with a capital they don't give to anyone? You are the flaw in the sum. You knew meridian and you were not on meridian. You are outside the accounting. Whatever you say, they cannot seal you away by sealing the world, because you are already elsewhere. For the first time in 4,000 years, there will be a mouth in that assembly that the closing of the record cannot reach. Wren looked at the old woman for a long time. One word, she said. One word, Idris agreed, so it had better be the right one. They talked, over the days that followed, in the way of people building something they both knew might not hold. Idris told her about the assembly, the vast tiered hall at the heart of the conquered, where the galaxy's people sent their voices, where nothing was decided because the even sum had decided everything, but where the appearance of consent was maintained with enormous ceremony. She told her about the subtractors, the pale, silent officiants who carried the ledger's edits into the world. She told her about the seat of the throne, which was not a chair but a well, a deep round shaft of dark at the hall's center, into which one looked down rather than up, because the conquered's power did not tower over you, it drew you in. And she told her, at last, about the children. Wren had not asked why. In 11 days of screaming and remembering she had never once asked why, because the question had seemed obscene, as though there could be a reason, as though a reason would help. But Idris, who had spent 30 years reading the sum, had a piece of the answer, and she gave it to Wren carefully, the way you give someone news that will not comfort and cannot be refused. The ledger is not only a record, Idris said, it's a projection. It doesn't only hold what has been, it computes what must be to keep the sum balanced going forward. And roughly a year ago the projection produced a discrepancy, a future in which the conquered's balance failed, a future in which the throne itself, the office, the whole 4,000-year architecture came apart. She paused. The projection traced the discrepancy to a source, to a cohort, to the youngest students of the conquered Lyceum on Meridian. One of those children, the ledger computed, would grow to be the undoing of the throne. It could not resolve which. The mathematics gave it a set, not a member. Wren had gone very cold. So he subtracted the set, she said. He subtracted the set, Idris said. 5,731 children, to be certain of removing one he could not name. And by the doctrine, no one acted and no crime occurred, and a threat to the even sum was balanced before it could arise. That's the accounting, Wren. That's the whole of it. He unmade a school full of the young of 40 peoples, because his arithmetic told him that somewhere among them was the person who would end him, and he would rather erase 5,730 children than let the one he feared exist. For a long moment Wren could not speak. The columns of ash that would not fall stood behind her eyes. He was afraid, she said at last. He would tell you the throne cannot be afraid, Idris said. Fear requires a self. But he was. Wren heard her own voice go quiet and strange. You don't erase a whole world to be certain unless you're afraid. You don't unmake 5,000 children to kill one unless you believe, somewhere under all the doctrine, that the one can hurt you. He spent 4,000 years saying he's not a person, and then he found out a person was coming for him, and it frightened him so badly that he erased a school full of the young to be safe from it. She looked up at Idris. That's not the act of a thing with no self. That's the act of a self that's terrified of being found. Idris Solemn, who had spent 30 years in rooms designed to erase her and had learned to keep her face still, did not keep it still. Something moved across it that might, in a younger woman, have been hope. Say that again, she said softly, the way you just said it. He was afraid, Wren said. No, the other part. He's a self that's terrified of being found. Idris sat back slowly. Then the whole thing, she said, the whole 4,000-year machine comes down to one question. Can you find him? Can you say the one word that reaches past the office and touches the person hiding inside it? Because a person can be held to account, girl. A person can be broken, but only if you can make him, for one breath, be a person again. She shook her head. I don't know what that word is. I've watched him for 30 years and I don't know. But you knew those children and I didn't, and maybe that's the difference. Maybe the word isn't in any doctrine. Maybe it's in the garden you keep talking about in your sleep. Wren had not known she talked in her sleep. She did not answer. But behind her teeth, small and certain, the word she had already chosen grew a little warmer. On the 7th day, the humans did the thing that Wren would remember at the end of her life, as the moment she stopped being only a survivor and started being a witness. They read the names. Idris had brought them, all of them, 5,731, carried not in the conquered systems, which no longer admitted the children had existed, but in the oldest and stupidest and most unbreakable human archive there was, which was other humans. In the 2 centuries since humanity had joined the galaxy, its envoys had learned the hard way that anything entered into a conquered system could be edited out of history, and so they had built, quietly and without asking permission, a shadow practice that the conquered found faintly disgusting and entirely beneath notice. They wrote things down, on paper, in stone, in the memories of trained rememberers who could hold 10,000 names and pass them, mouth to mouth, down a line of the living so that no edit could reach them all at once. When the Lyceum fell, the conquered had sealed Meridian's records within the hour. But a veiled registrar sympathetic to the young, 3 days before the subtraction, on a hunch she could not have explained, had copied the Lyceum's enrollment roll onto a physical medium and passed it to a human trade envoy, who had passed it to Idris, who had done with it the thing humans did. She had it carved. The 4 of them had brought aboard a long panel of dark stone, and into it, over the days of the crossing, they cut the names. Not with machines, with hands and tools and time, the slow, deliberate human insistence that a name worth keeping was worth the ache in the wrist that kept it. They took turns. They read each name aloud as they cut it, so that the name would exist twice, once in the stone and once in the air, and the air's copy would settle into whoever was in the room and be carried onward in the flesh. On the seventh day, they asked Wren to cut Aya's name. She had not cut stone before. Idris showed her the angle of the tool and then stepped back and let her fail at it for a while, because failing at it was part of it, because a name that came easy was a name half kept. Wren's hands shook. The first stroke was crooked and she nearly wept with the wrongness of it, and then she steadied, and she thought about a 6-year-old who asked questions in threes and loved a word that meant a thing could be asked to happen again, and she cut. AYA. 3 letters. The smallest name in the smallest cohort of a school the galaxy had agreed would never have been. She read it aloud as she cut it, the way the practice required, and her voice did not break, because she had done all her breaking already, and what was left was harder than that. Aya, she said, into the air, into the room, into the 4 humans who would carry it now whether the ledger liked it or not. And the old envoy, Idris Soling, who had watched the throne seal 100 worlds and had never once in 30 years seen a witness win. Idris looked at the 3 carved letters and the girl who had cut them, and she said a thing under her breath that Wren was not sure she was meant to hear. He unmade a world, Idris murmured, to be certain of erasing 1 child. And here she is, cut in stone, said aloud, carried in 5 human mouths, 9 light days from his throne. She almost smiled. It was a terrible smile, the smile of someone who has found, very late, the one place the enemy forgot to guard. The one thing he most needed gone, and it's the one thing we've made most certain to keep. Wren looked at the name she had cut. Behind her teeth, the word she had chosen was no longer only a word. It had a shape now, and a weight, and 3 small letters, and the memory of a gap where 2 front teeth had been. 2 days to the throne. The seat of the conquered was called the Even City, and it was not a city in any sense a human would recognize. It was a single continuous structure the size of a small moon, hung in the dark between 3 cold stars, and it did not glow. That was the first thing that struck Wren as the conquered vessel drew near, that a place so vast and so powerful gave off no light of its own. It drank the light of the 3 stars and returned nothing, a pale, enormous smoothness turning slowly against the black, and she understood without being told that this too was doctrine. The conquered did not shine. The conquered balanced. A thing that shines has spent something. A thing that balances has spent nothing ever and never will. Idris stood beside her at the viewport as the Even City swallowed the sky. Remember what it's for, the old woman said quietly. All of it. The size, the silence, the dark. It's built to make you feel like a rounding error. That's the entire architecture. By the time you stand at the well, you're supposed to have already agreed that you're too small to matter. Most delegations agree somewhere around now, looking out this window. Don't. How do I not? Idris was quiet for a moment. Hold the small thing, she said. Whatever your word is, it's small. Good. This whole city is a machine for convincing you that small things don't count. So hold yours where you can feel it. And every time the size of this place tells you nothing you say will matter, you press your thumb against the small thing, and you remember that they built a city the size of a moon and they still sent servants across a dead garden to fetch 1 girl. Because there is one thing in the sum they cannot balance, and it is small, and it is yours. Wren pressed her thumb against the pad of her forefinger, where the ache of cutting stone still lived, and she held the small thing. They were 9 days housing her, and in those days the conquered tried with great courtesy to make her not speak. It did not threaten. Wren came to understand that the conquered almost never threatened. Threat was a crude instrument, a spending, and the even sum did not spend. Instead it offered. On the first day in the even city, a delegation of the ordinate came to her quarters. Not the tall, unlit servants of the even sum, but the gray clerks, 3 of them, bearing what they called a resolution. The resolution was generous. Wren would later understand exactly how generous, and it would make her sick. The Concord proposed that the subtraction of meridian be recorded not as a subtraction, but as a discrepancy absorbed, a softer edit, one that did not require the full sealing, one that would permit a residue to remain. And the residue they offered was the children, not their lives, those were beyond even the Concord's giving, but their record. The Concord offered to let the 5,731 remain in the ledger, named, acknowledged to have existed. A memorial would be permitted, an actual memorial in stone in the even city itself, where no memorial had ever stood, listing every name. Humanity standing in the assembly would be raised. Meridian would be mourned. In exchange, Wren would decline the word. She would stand before the assembly, as the form required, and when she was offered the single utterance, she would give the ancient answer of a witness who chooses silence, a formula that meant the residue was discharged by grace rather than by speaking, and the rite would close, and the children would be remembered forever, and the throne would never once be named as their author. "They're offering to keep them," Wren said to Idris that night, and her voice shook because it was the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to her, and it was dressed as a kindness. "They're offering to let Aya exist, in stone, in their own city, forever. All I have to do is not say my word." Idris did not answer at once. She was too honest to answer quickly. "Yes," she said finally, "that's what they're offering, and you need to understand it clearly because it's the most dangerous thing they've done. They can't reach you, you're outside the accounting, they can't seal you away. So they've done the only other thing that works. They've made your word cost something. If you speak, you refuse this, and if you refuse this, the children go back into the dark. That's the trade. Your word against their names. And they've built it so that the more you loved those children, the harder it is to speak." Wren stared at the wall. Would it work? Their memorial, would it last? "Longer than the sun over your city," Idris said. "The Concord keeps what it agrees to keep. If they carve those names in the even city, those names will outlast humanity. It's not a lie, Wren. That's what makes it terrible. It's a real offer of a real forever, and all it asks in return is that you let the one who did this remain no one." Wren was quiet for a long time. She thought about the memorial they were offering, 5,731 names in the heart of the even city, safe, permanent, honored. She thought about how good it would feel to save them. To have come all this way and saved them. To let a 6-year-old exist forever in stone in the greatest city in the galaxy. And then she thought about the shape of the offer, and the cold of it reached her. "They don't care about the children," she said slowly. "They never cared about the children. They subtracted them without a second thought. So why would they suddenly offer to keep them?" She looked at Idris. "They're not offering to save Aya. They're offering to buy my silence with her. They've found the one thing I want most in the universe, for her to be remembered, and they're holding it out to me on the condition that I let him stay no one. They're using her to protect him." Idris's dry face was very still. "Yes," she said. "He killed 5,731 children to keep himself safe," Wren said, and now her voice was not shaking anymore. "And now he wants to use those same children one more time to keep himself safe again. He wants to hide behind their memorial the way he hid behind their deaths." She found that she was standing. She did not remember standing. "No." "Wren." "No." The word came out of her clean and hard and certain, and she understood as she said it that she had just refused the most generous offer the Concord had made in 4,000 years, and that she was not sorry, and that Aya would have understood, because Aya had loved a word that meant a thing could be asked to happen again, and Wren would not let her be turned into a wall for a murderer to stand behind. "They can keep their memorial. I'll keep her. I've already kept her. She's cut in stone that no edit can reach and said aloud in 5 mouths that no seal can close, and she doesn't need there forever because she has mine. Tell them no. Idris Solin looked at the 17-year-old girl standing in the pale light of a room in a city built to make her feel like a rounding error. And the old envoy did something Wren had not seen her do in 9 days. She stood and she inclined her head, the small deep bow her people gave, very rarely to someone who had earned it. "I'll tell them no," she said. That night Wren could not sleep, and she did the thing she had been avoiding since the transport pulled away from Meridian. She let herself remember Aya whole. Not the name only. Not the gap where 2 front teeth had been. The whole child. The way Aya sat when she was thinking hard, 1 foot tucked under her, chin in both hands, scowling at the moss as though it owed her an explanation. The way she mispronounced Wren's name for the first 2 months and then, when she finally got it right, said it constantly, in every sentence, as if it were a toy she had been given and could not stop playing with. The morning Aya had cried because a snail had died on the low wall. A small local snail, nothing, and Wren had knelt with her and they had buried it under the moss. And Aya had insisted they say something. And Wren, 17 and improvising, had said the only true thing she could think of, which was that it had been here, and now it was gone, and they would remember it. And Aya had frowned and said that wasn't enough and dug it back up and looked at it a while longer, memorizing it, and then buried it again and said, "Now it's enough. Now I've kept it." Wren lay in the dark of a city built to make her small and understood that a 6-year-old had taught her, over a snail, the entire thing she had crossed the galaxy to learn. That keeping was not a feeling. It was a choice you made on purpose, with your eyes open, looking at the thing you had lost until you had it by heart and no arithmetic could take it from you. She had thought for 9 days that she was choosing a word to hurt the throne. She saw now that she was doing what Aya had done with the snail. She was digging the child back up, one last time, to look at her until she had her by heart, so that when she stood at the well, the name she spoke would not be a weapon she had sharpened, but a person she had kept. The difference mattered. She did not fully know why yet, but it mattered, and she trusted it the way she had learned to trust the small certain thing behind her teeth. A weapon aimed at the throne would fall into the accounting and be closed. But a person, kept and carried and set down gently into the dark, she did not think the accounting had ever been built to close over that. Nobody builds a defense against a thing they have never once felt. She thought about that for a long time, and toward what would have been morning if the even city had permitted such things, she found she was not rehearsing anymore. She was simply keeping Aya company, the way you keep company with someone you are about to have to say goodbye to, and it was the closest thing to peace she had felt in 19 days. The conquered tried once more, on the last night, and this time it was not the gray clerks. It was one of the tall, unlit servants of the even sum, the same one, Wren thought, though she could not be sure, that had crossed the dead garden to fetch her, the one that had said, against all its training, that it did not entirely wish her to fail. It came alone, and it stood at a courteous distance, and it did not offer her anything. "You have refused the resolution," it said. "I have." "You mean to speak the word?" "I do." The tall servant was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, its trained and accentless voice was as careful as she had ever heard it. "I have served the even sum for 600 years, it said, and I have carried witnesses to the well 11 times, and 11 times I have watched the well close over what they said. I want you to understand what you are choosing. You believe you have found the flaw. You are outside the accounting. Your word cannot be sealed away by sealing the world. This is true, but you have reasoned only halfway. Ask yourself, if the flaw were so simple, would it have survived 4,000 years? The form permits a witness one word because the conquered long ago proved that one word cannot matter. Not because the word can be sealed, because the well does not need to seal it. The well only needs the assembly to agree that it did not matter. And the assembly always agrees, because the throne is not a person, and a word aimed at no one strikes no one, and the galaxy has 40 peoples who have all learned, watching, that grief is a thing you let go, and the even sum is a thing you do not fight. It took a step closer, which it had not done before. You will stand at the well, it said, and you will say your one word, and it will be true, and it will be brave, and it will be the best word any witness has ever chosen. And the throne will look at you with the eyes of an office that has been hollowed of every self, and it will feel nothing, because there will be nothing there to feel it, and the assembly will watch the throne feel nothing, and they will conclude, as they always conclude, that the word did not land because it landed on no one. And Meridian will be sealed, not because your word was sealed, because your word had no one to break. The servant's unblinking eyes held hers. That is what I have come to tell you, child, at cost to myself, because I have crossed a dead garden for you, and I find I am not indifferent. The throne cannot be broken by a word aimed at the throne. There is no one there. If you want to break it, you must not aim at the throne at all. Wren stood very still. Then what do I aim at? She asked, though a part of her already knew, had known since a warm room 9 light days out, had known since Idris said the whole machine comes down to one question: can you find him? The tall servant of the even sum looked at her for a long moment, and then it did the last thing she expected, the thing she would remember when she was old and the even city was a memory. It answered her honestly, against every year of its training, as though something in the hollow architecture of its own long service had, for one breath, remembered that it had once been someone too. Aim, it said quietly, at the person he was before they made him no one. If there is anything left of that person under 4,000 years of office, then a word can reach it. But only a word that person could not have made himself deaf to, a word from before, a word he cannot receive as the throne, because the throne has no ears for it, but the person does, because the person is the only thing in that hollow that the word was ever shaped to touch. It straightened. I do not know what such a word would be. I am not certain such a person still exists, but you knew children, and I have only ever known the sum, and perhaps the difference is the whole of it. Sleep, witness. Tomorrow you go to the well. It turned to leave, and at the door it paused, and without turning back it said one more thing, so quietly that Wren was never afterward entirely sure she had heard it and not dreamed it. When I was young, the tall servant said, before the even sum I had a name too. I have not thought of it in 600 years. Tonight, for some reason, I find that I can almost remember it. A pause. Whatever you are going to do to him, child, do it well. Some of us have been waiting longer than we knew. And it was gone. Wren stood alone in the pale room at the heart of a city built to make her small, and she pressed her thumb against the ache of cutting stone, and she held the small thing behind her teeth, and she did not sleep, but she was not afraid. Tomorrow she would go to the well. Tomorrow she would find the person under the throne. And she knew now exactly what she would say. The assembly of the conquered was the largest room Wren had ever stood in, and it was built around an absence. She had expected a throne. She had spent 9 days imagining a high seat, a figure raised above her, all the ordinary architecture of power that a human mind reaches for. There was none of that. The assembly was a vast inverted bowl, tier upon tier of galleries rising away into shadow, and every tier faced inward and downward, and at the very center of the floor, where in a human hall there might have been a stage, there was a well. It was perfectly round, perhaps 30 paces across, and it was dark, not the dark of a shadowed pit, but a deeper dark, a dark that seemed to have a surface, the way still water has a surface, so that looking at it you felt not that you were seeing into a hole, but that the hole was seeing out of itself. The galleries were full. 40 peoples and more had sent their voices. Wren saw the segmented ranks of the crustacean thinkers, the slow pale masses of the veil, 100 shapes she had no names for, all of them turned inward and down toward the well, all of them silent, all of them waiting. Idris walked at Wren's shoulder as the servants brought her onto the floor. The old envoy's face was composed, but Wren had learned to read her in 9 days, and she saw what the composure cost. "When they give you the word," Idris murmured, so low that only Wren could hear, "there will be a moment, a held breath. They'll expect the formula of silence. They still think you'll take the resolution even now, some of them, because no one refuses the conquered this late. Use the moment. Don't rush. He'll try to fill the silence because the throne always speaks last, and if you let him, whatever he says will be perfect and it will bury you. So don't wait for him to finish being perfect. Find your moment and take it." She pressed something into Wren's hand, a small flat weight, and Wren realized it was a fragment of the carved stone, a chip cut from the panel where Aya's name was written. "Hold her," Idris said. "All the way down." And then the servants drew Idris back, and Wren stood alone at the edge of the well. The throne spoke, and the whole assembly listened, and Wren understood at once why 4,000 years had failed to break it. There was no figure. That was the thing the imagination could not have prepared her for. When the throne spoke, the voice came up out of the well itself, from the dark surface that seemed to see, and it was not loud, and it was not cold in the way she had expected. It was worse than cold. It was reasonable. It was the most reasonable voice she had ever heard, a voice with no edges anywhere, a voice that had been sanded smooth of every self across 4,000 years, until nothing remained that could be argued with, because there was nothing there that wanted anything. "The assembly is gathered," said the throne, "for the sealing of a discrepancy. The record shows a world-designated meridian, and upon it an institution of instruction, and within that institution a body of the young. The projection of the even sum identified within that body a source of future imbalance, a divergence that would, if permitted to develop, have exceeded the ledger's capacity to correct. In accordance with the oldest principle of the conquered, the source was subtracted before it could arise. The sum is balanced. The assembly is asked to witness the sealing, that the record and the witnessed may agree, and the residue be discharged." It was so smooth that for a moment Wren felt the pull of it, the terrible reasonable pull to simply agree, to let the arithmetic be arithmetic, to be a rounding error and go home. She pressed the stone chip into her palm until it hurt. "Before the seal is set," the throne continued, "the form provides for the witness. A being is present who knew the subtracted body and stood outside the accounting at the hour of its closing. This is recorded. The witness is entitled to the word. A pause, reasonable, patient. The witness may speak or may decline in grace, and the residue is discharged either way. Let the witness come to the well." The servants did not push her. She walked to the edge herself, and she looked down into the dark that seemed to see, and somewhere in that dark, she knew, was the office that had emptied a world, and somewhere under the office, if Idris was right, if the tall servant was right, if her whole terrible hope was right, was a person. "You are the witness," said the throne, and the reasonable voice came up around her like water. "You knew the subtracted body." "I knew the children," Wren said. Her voice was small in the enormous bowl, but it did not shake. "Yes. You understand what is asked. You may speak the word or you may decline it. Before you choose, the throne will observe, for the benefit of the assembly and for your own, that speech will not alter the sealing. This has been true for 4,000 years. Nothing that is said at the well has ever changed what the well records. The form is honored by your presence. Whether you speak or are silent, meridian will be sealed, and the young will be as though they had not been. The throne tells you this not to dissuade you, but because it is true, and because the witness should choose knowing the truth." And there it was, the trap the tall servant had named, laid out gently, reasonably in the open. "Nothing you say can matter, not because we will silence you, because there is no one here for your word to land on. Say it and watch it fall." Wren looked down into the well. "Can I ask you something first?" she said. A pause. The assembly was utterly still. Witnesses did not ask the throne questions. The form did not provide for it. But the form did not forbid it either, and the throne, being reasonable, had no reason to refuse. "You may ask," it said. You said the projection found a source, one child among all of them who'd grow up to end you, but it couldn't tell you which one. Wren kept her voice level. So you erased all of them, 5,731 to be certain of one. That is an accurate description of the balancing, yes. Why couldn't you find the one? The projection resolved to a set, said the throne, not to a member. The mathematics of the future are not the mathematics of the past. The one could not be identified without permitting the divergence to develop, and to permit it to develop was to accept the imbalance the subtraction was intended to prevent. Therefore the set was closed. This is elementary. It's not elementary, Wren said. It's the most important thing in this room and you don't even see it. You couldn't tell which child would end you. So somewhere in that school there was one child who was going to grow up and undo the whole even sum, undo 4,000 years of you, and you couldn't pick her out. She looked exactly like all the others to you. She was just a child in a garden. The thing that was going to end you was indistinguishable to you from an ordinary 6-year-old asking questions about moss. She let that sit for a moment in the vast still bowl. You didn't erase a threat. You erased a school because you couldn't tell the difference between a threat and a child. That's not power. That's blindness. For the first time, the throne did not answer immediately. It was a small thing, a pause a fraction longer than reason required. But Wren had spent 9 days being told to watch for exactly this, and she saw it, and so, she knew, did Idris in the gallery, and so did a tall unlit servant somewhere in the dark who had almost remembered its name. You are describing, said the throne at last, and its voice was as reasonable as ever, the limits of projection. They are known. They are not blindness. They are the reason the conquered subtract sets rather than members. The throne does not need to distinguish the threat from the child because the throne removes the whole and the whole includes the threat and the sum is balanced. You have mistaken thoroughness for weakness. It is a common error among the young. No, Wren said softly. I've mistaken nothing. You're the one who's mistaken. You think you removed the whole. You didn't. You missed one. The stillness in the assembly changed. Wren felt it change, felt 40 peoples lean, some infinitesimal fraction inward and down. Explain, said the throne. You subtracted everyone on meridian, Wren said, but not everyone who was meridian was on meridian. I wasn't. I was 4 light hours out reading a book not looking back. I'm in the accounting nowhere. And that means the one thing you were trying to erase. The child who'd grow up to end you, maybe you got her, and maybe you didn't because there was a witness outside the sum and you can't compute what a witness carries because a witness carries it in the one place your ledger has never been able to reach. She lifted her chin. You wanted to be certain. You erased 5,730 children to be certain. And you're not certain. You've never once since Meridian been certain. Because I'm still here and I knew them, and you don't know what I know. The witness may speak the word, said the throne, and for the first time buried very deep under the reason there was something else. Not fear. The throne could not fear. But the shape where fear would go if there were anyone there to fear. The form provides one utterance. Speak it, and the residue is discharged, and this will conclude. It wanted her to speak now. She understood that with sudden clarity. It had been so patient, so reasonable, and now it wanted her to hurry, because she was standing at the edge of its one uncertainty, and every word she said made the uncertainty larger in front of 40 watching peoples, and the fastest way to end that was to let her spend her single word and be done. So she did not hurry. You grieve, said the throne, and the reasonable voice turned now to the thing it understood best, the argument it had used to still 4,000 years of assemblies. The throne observes it in you. It is the human condition. The conquered has studied it. You carry the dead. You refuse to set them down. You believe this refusal is strength, and the throne tells you without cruelty that it is the oldest weakness in the galaxy. Every people that has endured has learned to release its dead. The veil released them as a mercy. The prime thinkers closed them into a final sum. They did this because they understood a thing your young species has not yet had time to learn, that nothing endures, not worlds, not names, not grief itself. The even sum is the only permanence, and the even sum is balance, and balance keeps nothing. You have crossed 9 light days carrying a child who is not there. Name one thing, human, that endures. Name one thing your grief has kept that the sum cannot take. You cannot, because there is nothing. And a witness who has nothing that endures has nothing to speak that will not fall. The assembly was silent. It was, Wren understood, the throne's masterpiece, the argument that had made a galaxy consent to its own erasure, the reasonable voice explaining that since nothing lasts, nothing lost was worth the fight to keep it, that grief was only the failure to have finished forgetting. And Wren, who had come 9 light days to study exactly this, who had spent 3 years learning how 40 peoples put their dead down, and 1 people would not, felt the last of her fear go out of her, because she had the answer, and she had had it since a garden and a snail and a 6-year-old who dug the dead back up to keep them properly. "You're right," she said. "Nothing endures, not worlds, not names, not even grief. Everything I love is going to be taken from me eventually. That's true. You've built your whole 4,000 years on it being true." She looked into the dark. "But you've drawn the wrong lesson from it, and you've had 4,000 years to draw the wrong lesson deeper, so I don't blame you for not seeing it. You think because nothing endures, nothing is worth keeping. We think the opposite. We think because nothing endures, keeping is the only thing that matters. You don't carry the dead because they'll last forever. You carry them because they won't, and because for as long as you do, they're not gone yet. That's not weakness. That's the only defiance there is. Every name I keep is a thing you didn't get to take for as long as I'm alive to keep it. And then I'll teach it to someone and they'll keep it after me. You can't outweight that. You've tried. You erased a whole world to outweight one name, and here I am, still keeping it 9 light days from your throne." She let the silence hold. "You asked me to name one thing my grief has kept that the sum can't take. I'm about to." "Do you know," Wren said, "what the hardest part of the last 19 days has been? It hasn't been the ash. It hasn't been the screaming or the clerks telling me I was describing a set with no members. It's been trying to decide what to say to you. One word. They kept telling me it had to be the right one, so I made lists. I listed everything you are. Murderer, butcher, coward, and every one of them was true, and every one of them was useless, because you've spent 4,000 years making yourself into something those words can't touch. You made yourself into no one, so that no one could be blamed, so that when you did the worst thing anyone in this galaxy has ever done, there'd be no self left for the doing to attach to. The throne does not act," it said. "The even sum expresses." "I know your doctrine," Wren said. "I've heard it from everyone. The throne doesn't do. There's no author. It was balanced, not chosen. And it's very clever, and it's kept you safe for 4,000 years, and it's the reason no word aimed at you has ever landed, because there's no one there for it to land on." She looked into the dark that seemed to see. "So I'm not going to aim at you." A silence then, a real one. The whole assembly held it. "When I finally understood what to say," Wren went on, and her voice had gone very quiet, and the enormous bowl was so still that the quiet carried to its highest tier, "I stopped trying to find a word big enough to be your crime, because there isn't one. You erased a world. There's no word that size. And then I stopped trying to find a word to reach the throne at all, because the throne is exactly what you built it to be, hollow and reasonable and deaf. And I thought instead about the person. The one they hollowed out, the child they took 4,000 years ago before there was a throne, the person you were before you agreed to be no one." She pressed the stone chip into her palm until it cut. "Because that person is still in there. He has to be. Because a thing with no self doesn't erase a world to keep itself safe. Only a self that's afraid does that. And I don't have a word for the throne, but I have a word for him, for the person hiding inside the office. And it's not a big word. It's the smallest word I know." "Speak the word," said the throne. And now the reason in it was thin, stretched, a surface over something the assembly had never seen and could not name, and be finished. Wren looked down into the well. She thought about a garden where the ash would not fall. She thought about a veiled registrar who had copied a roll on a hunch she could not explain. She thought about 5 human mouths carrying 5,731 names past every seal in the galaxy. She thought about the ache in her wrist from cutting 3 letters into stone, and a gap where 2 front teeth had been, and a small voice that had loved a word meaning a thing could be asked to happen again. She held the child all the way down, and into the well that had swallowed a world, into the dark that seemed to see, into the hollow at the center of 4,000 years of power. Before the throne could speak its reasonable last, Wren Halloran said the one human word she had carried 9 light days behind her teeth. Not a curse, not an accusation, not a word aimed at the throne at all, but a name, small and certain and unredactable, spoken aloud so that it would exist twice, once in the air and once in everyone who heard it. Aya. For a moment, nothing happened. The name went out over the well and into the vast inverted bowl, 3 small sounds, a child's name in a human mouth, and the assembly received it the way it had received every word for 4,000 years, as a thing already accounted for, already falling, already closed. Wren felt the galleries begin to settle back. She heard, somewhere above and behind her, the faint collective motion of 40 peoples preparing to watch the throne feel nothing. And the throne did not feel nothing. The dark surface of the well, which had seemed to see, went still in a new way, not the stillness of patience, but the stillness of a thing that has been struck, and has not yet understood that it has been struck. And into the silence, the reasonable voice came up out of the well, and it said, without any command in it, without any form or function, in a tone the assembly had never in 4,000 years heard from the throne, one word. Aya. It repeated the name. Wren did not move. She did not breathe, because she understood, in the instant the throne said it, exactly what had happened, and she understood that it could not be taken back. The throne had spoken a subtracted name. For 4,000 years, the entire art of the conquered had rested on a single, unbreakable rule, so deep that it had never needed to be written. The throne unmakes. The throne does not make. The ledger struck names out of reality, and the throne was the hand that struck them, and the striking was clean precisely because the throne never spoke what it had struck. To name a thing is to make it. To say a name aloud is to declare that the named exists, that it is present, that it is real enough to be called. And the throne had just called, unbidden, unreasoning, out of some place 4,000 years of hollowing had never quite emptied, the name of a child it had subtracted. It had reauthored her. By the conquered's own arithmetic, the moment the throne spoke Aya's name, Aya existed. Not in memory only, not in human stone only, but in the record, in the sum, restored by the one voice in the galaxy that could not be contradicted. The throne's word was reality. That was the whole of its power, and the throne had spent its word making a subtracted child real again. And a child who exists is a child who was killed. And a killing has an author. And the author had just named himself. Wren watched it happen. She had come to the well believing she was carrying a weapon, and she had been right, but she had not understood until this moment what the weapon was. It was not the name. The name was only the key. The weapon was the doctrine itself, the beautiful, patient, 4,000-year architecture of deniability that the throne had built to keep any word from ever landing. She had not broken it from outside. She had made it break itself. She had found the one word that the office could not receive as the office, that could only be received by the person hiding inside it. And the person had received it, and the person had answered, and in answering, the person had reached up through the hollow and taken hold of the throne's own voice and used it to say a name, and the saying had turned every law of the conquered against the one it had been built to protect. The dark surface of the well began to change. It was not violent. That was the thing Wren would try for the rest of her life, to make people understand that there was no fire in it, no collapse, nothing that a recording could have captured. What happened at the center of the assembly was the quietest thing she had ever seen, and it was the most terrible, because what she was watching was a self coming back into a place that had spent 4,000 years being emptied of it. And a self is a heavy thing to receive all at once, and it is heavier still when the first thing it must hold is what it has done. Aya, the throne said a third time, and now the voice was not the throne's. The reason was gone out of it. The sanded smooth edgelessness was gone. What was left was a voice, an actual voice, with an accent in it. The accent of a world and a childhood 4,000 years dead. The accent of the person they had taken young and given to the ledger and written out one careful piece at a time until nothing remained that could be called by a name. And that voice, that person, newly and unbearably present at the center of the greatest power in the galaxy, said, in a tone of dawning and bottomless horror, "What have I done?" It was not a question. The form of the conquered did not provide for it, and neither did the person asking it, because he already knew. That was the whole of the breaking. He knew. For 4,000 years the doctrine had held that the throne could not be guilty, because the throne had no self to bear guilt. And in the space of 3 small sounds the self had come back, and it had come back into a being that had erased a school full of children to keep itself safe. And now it had to hold that, all of it, all 5,731, with a self that could not put them down. The galleries erupted, not into noise, for the peoples of the assembly did not make noise, but into motion, a vast inward and downward leaning of 40 species who had watched the throne seal 100 worlds without a flicker, and were now watching it come apart at the center of its own hall, undone not by a fleet, not by a rebellion, but by a girl and a name and its own reasonable voice saying, "What have I done?" The tall, unlit servants of the even sum moved, then. Wren saw them come down out of the dark of the galleries, quick and silent, converging on the well the way the servants had converged. Idris had said, on the delegate whose flicker had been undone within the hour. And Wren's heart clenched, because this was the part she had not been able to plan for, the part where the machine repaired itself, where the flaw was sealed and the residue discharged, and by the next session no one remembered that a girl had ever spoken. But the machine could not repair this, because the flaw was no longer outside the accounting. The flaw was the throne. The servants of the even sum reached the edge of the well and they stopped, all of them, and they did not seal anything, because there was nothing they could seal. You cannot subtract a name the throne itself has spoken. The throne's word is the highest authority in the record, higher than the ledger, higher than the servants, and the throne had said Aya 3 times, and by the conquered's own law that made her real and real past unmaking. And the servants of the even sum stood at the edge of the well and had, for the first time in 4,000 years, nothing to do. And then one of them spoke, the tall one, the one that had crossed a dead garden that had almost remembered its name. The throne has spoken a subtracted name, it said, and its trained and accentless voice carried through the whole vast bowl, flat and clear and final. By the first principle of the conquered, the throne unmakes and does not make. A throne that makes is not the throne. By its own word it has authored. By its own word it is an author. By its own word it is a self, and a self that has authored a subtraction is not the even sum expressing necessity. It is a person who has done a thing. The servant turned its unblinking eyes up toward the galleries, toward 40 watching peoples. The office is void. There is no throne. There is only the one who was hollowed to hold it, returned to himself by the word of the witness, and standing accountable before the assembly for the deaths of 5,731 children of 40 peoples. The even sum requires an author to be balanced against what he has done. Let the balancing begin. Wren understood distantly that she had just heard the end of 4,000 years. Not with a weapon, with a definition. The conquered had built its throne to be unaccountable by making it no one, and the machine had held for 4,000 years because no one had ever found the word that could make the throne, for one breath, be someone. And the moment it was someone, the same laws that had made it invincible turned and made it guilty, because the whole terrible logic ran both ways, and no one had ever thought to run it backward, because no one had ever believed a witness could reach the person under the office, because no one but humans had ever thought that a name, held in the flesh and said aloud, was a thing that could not be unmade. At the center of the well, the person who had been the throne made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a self makes when it can no longer not know what it has done, when 4,000 years of not knowing come down all at once onto a single self that must now hold them, and cannot, and does not get to stop holding them. Wren had spent 3 years studying grief, the way 40 peoples carried their dead, and she had never heard a sound like it, and she hoped she never would again, and she did not look away, because she had come 9 light days to be a witness, and a witness does not look away. "Say it again," the person who had been the throne said, and the voice was small now and broken and unbearably present. "Please, say it again. I need to have heard it." "Say her name again." And Wren Halloran, 17 years old, standing at the edge of the well that had swallowed her world, looked down at the man they had made into a monster and unmade back into a man, the man who had erased a school full of children rather than let one of them exist, the man whose entire 4,000-year power she had just ended with a word he had used to end himself. Wren looked at him, and she found to her own surprise that she was not cruel, because Aya had not been cruel. Because a garden is not made of cruelty, and she gave him the name a final time, not as a weapon now but as the truth it had always been. "Aya," she said. And the man who had been the cruelest power in the galaxy put what remained of himself into the dark, and wept the way only a self can weep, and was, at last, no one at all, not the manufactured no one of the doctrine, safe and hollow and unaccountable, but the true nothing of a person who has learned exactly what he is and cannot survive the knowing. They did not seal Meridian. They could not. The record would not close. There was, at the center of the ledger now, a name the highest authority in the conquered had spoken into permanence, and around that name a whole world refused to be unmade, because a subtraction with a witnessed residue is not a subtraction, and the residue was 5 human mouths and 40 leaning peoples and a chip of carved stone in a girl's cut palm, and it would never discharge, not in 4,000 years, not in 40,000. So Meridian was remembered instead. It was the first thing the assembly did in the strange raw days that followed, with the well gone dark and empty, and the office void, and the servants of the even some moving through their vast city like beings who had woken from a long dream and were not sure they wanted to be awake. They read the names, all of them. Idris Soline brought the carved panel into the assembly and set it at the edge of the empty well, and the reading took 9 days, because there were 5,731 of them, and 40 peoples took turns, and each name was said aloud so that it would exist twice, once in the stone and once in the air, and each one settled into whoever heard it and was carried on. They called it the naming. It became law, the one law the broken conquered agreed on before it agreed on anything else, before it decided what to be now that it could no longer be what it was, that no being subtracted would go unnamed, that the record would keep what it had once erased, that grief, the human refusal to let the dead be no one, would be written into the arithmetic of the galaxy as a thing that counted, a thing with weight, a residue that must be balanced and never sealed. The species that had folded their dead into final sums began, haltingly, to learn the human art of carrying them. The veil, who had released their dead into forgetting as a mercy, held their first naming in the history of their people, and their old registrar, the one who had copied a roll on a hunch she could not explain, read the names of the Meridian children she had saved, and did not release them, and found that she did not want to. The tall servant of the even sum came to her once more, before the human ship left the even city. It found her at the edge of the empty well where the naming had been read, and it stood at a courteous distance, as it always had, and it said nothing for a while. "I remembered my name," it said at last. "In the night after, 600 years, and it came back all at once, the way yours came back to him. I had thought it was gone. It was only kept somewhere I had stopped being able to reach." It turned its unblinking eyes on her. "You did not only break a throne, child. You reminded a great many of us that we were people once under the offices we agreed to become. That is a heavier gift than you know, and not all of us will thank you for it, but I do. I crossed a dead garden for you, and I was not indifferent, and now I know why. Go home, keep your dead, teach the galaxy how. It appears we have forgotten, and it appears we cannot afford to any longer." It did not tell her its name. She did not ask. Some things a person keeps for themselves, and she of all people understood that. Wren went home eventually. There was a great deal the assembly wanted from her, honors and titles and a permanent voice in the forums, and she declined most of it because she was 17 and then 18, and she wanted to finish a thesis on comparative grief rights that had turned out to matter more than she could have known. She kept the chip of carved stone. She visited Meridian once, years later, when the ash had finally learned how to fall, and she found that the garden had been made into a memorial, and that the low walls painted the color of a summer no one on Meridian had ever seen had been left exactly as they were, and that at the center of it, cut in dark stone, were 3 letters that a girl had once carved with a shaking hand. She was old before she understood fully what she had done, old and dry and unhurried, the way Idris Solene had been, in rooms that no longer tried to erase her. People asked her about it always. They asked how a single word had broken the unbreakable, how a child's name had ended 4,000 years, and she found that the answer never got easier to say, because it was so simple that it embarrassed the enormous thing it explained. He had made himself into no one, so that no one could be blamed. And she had said a name, the smallest, truest, most human thing there is, the thing her species had crossed 9,000 light years still stubborn enough to keep. And the name had reached past the office to the person, and the person had answered, and in answering had become someone again, and a someone can be broken because a someone can know what he has done. The galaxy remembered him as the cruelest emperor who had ever lived, the one who slaughtered 5,731 children to be certain of erasing one. But that was not the part Wren told at the end, when the young ones asked. She told them the other part, the part that was the whole reason any of it mattered. He erased a world to make sure a single name could never be spoken. And a girl who loved that child spoke it anyway, one small human word into the dark that had swallowed everything. And it was the one thing in all his 4,000 years that he could not unmake, because it was already carried, already said, already kept. "Aya," she would say to the young ones at the very end, so that it would exist one more time, once in the air and once in them. And they would carry it on.